Hello, I'm Richard Kauntze, Chief Executive of the British Council for Offices, the BCO, and welcome to the latest in our series of interviews we call The New Normal. Each week I talk to a prominent member about the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on the office sector. Now, this week's interview has the broad theme of the office and the city. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to say that my guest to talk about all of that is Peter Rees. So welcome, Peter.
It's good to be with you, Richard, and change some ideas of people might have about the post-pandemic future.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And it's always a great pleasure to talk to you. For anyone who may not know, and I can't believe people don't, but should anyone not know, from 1985 to 2014, Peter was City Planning Officer at the City of London, where he led the planning and regulation of the world's leading business and financial centre. Today, Peter is Professor of Places and City Planning at University College London, UCL. Peter also lectures internationally and advises developers and cities around the world on urban planning and design. And if that wasn't enough, Peter is also a CBE and a stand-up comic. But more important than all of that, of course, is Peter's involvement with the BCO, which is unique. Peter attended the meeting in 1989, which led to the creation of the BCO, and has been elected to the Board of Management ever since. As I say, a unique achievement, and reflecting that and much more, Peter won our President's Award in 2003. So welcome again, Peter. I'm really grateful to you for spending some time with me and the BCO. I'll go straight to questions, if I may, and starting off on London, Peter. Do you think that the coronavirus pandemic will have an impact on London's position as the world's leading business and financial centre?
London has a history of coping with disasters. After all, this isn't the first plague we've received from China. I believe the first came in the 1340s with the Black Death, when half the population of the country died within a few years. And England and London never looked back, because England moved from agriculture to wool production, and the city began trading in commodities, and has done so ever since. In 1665, we had the Great Plague, followed by the Fire of London. And from that, we had the financial dealing and merchant banking explosion. So the city rebounded even more strongly. And then, of course, we've dealt with things like the Blitz, financial deregulation, which is where I came in 1985. And of course, in those days, we were trying to foresee the future. But of course, even a clever planner can't foresee the future. All you can hope to do is to build in sufficient flexibility to cope with what might happen. I mean, in 1985, when I was trying to plan for a deregulated City of London, if I'd known that in 30 odd years we'd have one of these things, where all my communications, my diary, my camera and everything else would be in my pocket, then I would probably have planned a completely different city. But what we did focus on back in 1985 and the subsequent years was to make the city a more pleasant place to be, rather than just a 9-to-5 office location where people arrived as last minute for work and left as soon as they could at 5 o'clock and went home to the suburbs because the city wasn't much fun. In the decades since then, provided better open spaces, nightlife, the facilities that people want during the day. We made it into a place. So what I would say is perhaps we put the place into workplace. And I'm very pleased we did, because when you look at the city model with its open spaces and the ability to have a more flexible way of working, the birth of WeWork and the shared workspace, that plays to the sort of city that we had for 2,000 years and we still have. It doesn't play terribly well to the American model that you see in places like Canary Wharf or all around the world. If you can only get 4 people at a time into an elevator, then the high-rise office is probably not the solution. And I say that sitting on the 27th floor of a residential block in the city where it's only allowed one person in the elevator at a time.
Fascinating stuff, Peter, and there's a lot we can draw from that. And you're right, of course, it's easy to forget, perhaps, you know, with the emergence of other cities, you know, all over the world, how old London is and how robust it is and how it has survived so much over the last 2,000 years or so. And I'm going to come on, if I may, to the City of London specifically. Now famously, when you were the city planning officer, you preferred to keep the City of London as a place just for business. Do you think this could change in the years to come, perhaps as a result of the pandemic?
I think that the trend for working more from home, and I always say from home rather than at home, is going to continue and develop. People will be going to the office perhaps less of the time. So it might be that people would go in for half of the week and work at home from home for half of the week. That's a flexibility. The city is always looking to places where things are being done differently. And back in around the noughties, I suppose, or perhaps a little before, the city spawned a sort of an offshoot just to the north in Shoreditch, which became Tech City or Silicon Roundabout. It started as a place that people went after work to have fun because the jazz clubs and the comedy cafes and the bars were there. People went to have fun. And then when we had the banking crash and a number of people were made redundant, they started up their own businesses, and they did it in Shoreditch because they wanted to work close to where they played. Now, it's been very interesting as Shoreditch has gentrified, as the development sector has pushed up the land prices and started building expensive investment apartments. So the startup firms have pushed south into the old city. And more buildings in the city are shared workspace and are occupied by startup companies and by these tech companies. And of course, they've brought with them their way of working. They might be sunbathing on the roof, they might be playing five-a-side in the street, they might be in the coffee bar, but they're still working. And that's the sort of thing that I expect to see a lot more of. The pandemic will accelerate those changes which had already begun. Now, as to whether the city should become mixed use in terms of being a mixture of residential and business, I don't think so. If you have a mixed use area, especially a mixed use area occupied by families, then the place will have to be quietened down to suit family life. Now, that's the last thing you want downtown. Families kill downtown because they don't want the unexpected, they don't want the edgy, they don't want the noisy. And that should be what the center of big cities is about. So the best mixture, as far as I'm concerned, is work and leisure downtown, where you can work and play, and then somewhere rather quieter to live with a distance, depending on whether you need extra space to bring up a family or whether you're young people just wanting somewhere to crash after work.
I think that's absolutely right, Peter. I mean, one thing I've noticed in my time working in the city, which is about 20 years or so, although my whole career has been working in London, is that how the city has changed in terms of its evening offer. I mean, it used to be a place that, you know, was completely died at the weekend and sort of obviously started very early as all financial centres, but you know, really died after about 8 o'clock at night. I mean, there's nothing. Everyone just went home, and that's really changed. And the whole sort of retail mix and the whole thing. And I know that's something that you played a big role in. But you mentioned working at home and you know the tensions. Let's drill on to the office, if I may, Peter. Now, unsurprisingly, there's been much talk in recent weeks about the longevity of the office and you know the shift, this experiment that we're all going through so rapidly. But what do you think, Peter, designers need to do to make the office stand out and give people a reason to go to the office as a destination?
It's what I was referring to earlier. It very often is not what happens inside the building and how clever the tech is. And we're all taught about artificial intelligence and big data and the clever building. And I can once remember a very erudite and amusing lawyer called Gary Hart saying at a lunch at the opening of one of the phases of Broadgate, this building has intelligent elevators. They're so intelligent they wouldn't let me in. And you know, we always think that there's a technological solution. But as I pointed out earlier, I didn't know what the technology was going to be when I had to replan the city in 1985. What I had to leave was accommodation for flexibility. And I can remember Alex Gordon, the president of the RIBA, when I was a student back in the early 70s, coming up with a saying to describe what future buildings should have, what three properties. And it was long life, of course that makes sense, loose fit, and low energy. Now the loose fit is very important. In the 70s, they didn't know that they were going to be needing raised floors within a couple of decades to accommodate the cabling. So the floor to ceiling height wasn't high enough to allow the raised floors, and those buildings had to be demolished. They assumed people were going to carry on working in cellular offices with messengers bringing their morning post and putting it in their in tray and taking stuff from their out tray on the way out. They didn't anticipate group working. So the buildings were built narrow enough to have an office on either side of a central corridor. Those buildings had to come down in the 80s. And I'm very pleased to say that the buildings that were put up in the late 80s are not being knocked down at the moment because they have that loose fit. Occasionally a few floors are being added on the top. The one you can see behind me is having an extra 10 floors added on the top of it. It's amazing how much extra structural integrity you can get when you don't need filing cabinets. And I'm also told that piles improve over the years and can carry more weight. But whatever the reason, there's a building that's doubling in height on the same structure. That's much more sustainable than knocking it all down and starting again. So I think it's ensuring that we carry on having the flexibility in the buildings, but above all, ensuring that we create good spaces around them. I showed two pictures on an online conference the other day, an international conference on the future of cities. And I chose a picture I'd taken a few weeks ago over at Cutler's Gardens in the eastern part of the city, one of the first campus-style developments of the mid-80s, exploiting some old Victorian warehouses and building new buildings in between. But of course, it was created as a campus with spaces as well as buildings. It's now occupied almost entirely by WeWork. And in the spaces, they have little pop-up timber houses, which have two walls and a roof, and a table and chairs and some artwork. And people go out and work in the open office with a roof over their heads. Even when it's raining, they can have their meeting out of doors. And of course, that's great because it's far less likely the boss will hear what you're saying. It's far less likely that the Chinese will know what you're up to. And so it's a great place for the modern surveillance age to have your meetings out of doors. And also, of course, it's great for social distancing. So I see that as a sign of the future, not necessarily the technology within the building, but the facilities the building creates around and in the spaces.
Fascinating stuff, PC. Yes, that sense of space and what's around is absolutely fundamental to the success of a city. And you know, the building needs to do a certain job, but what is around there, the overall environment. Your points on flexibility as well and repurposing, absolutely bang on, of course. You know, and that is so much of the BCO's core mantra. I'd like to move on, if I may, Peter, to the planning. Now, the lockdown has, unsurprisingly perhaps, led to calls for dramatic changes to city planning. For example, there's been much speculation that it will lead to an increase in pedestrianisation, and we've seen this almost instantly in Milan. So, looking at that, what changes would you like to see, Peter?
Well, of course, as you're aware, one of the side effects of the COVID virus is that it appears to have an effect on the eyesight of quite a lot of people. And in fact, I have noticed in the media and amongst certain experts that following the pandemic, they've developed a very severe case of 20/20 hindsight. It's very easy to know what you should have done but of course much harder to know what you should do for the future when you're faced with a novel virus or some other kind of problem. Now, I believe that in planning our places, as I've already said, we need to incorporate flexibility. We also need to provide a richness of place, a place people want to be and want to stay. And we need, as far as we can, to reduce travel. Now, it's probably more sustainable to have people traveling to central centres of excellence than it is to have people traveling between various suburban locations, because however much you move work to where people live, they won't stay in the same job and the same home. One or other will change, and they will end up driving from one place to another because they're all going in different directions and you can't provide public transport to meet that need. Now, we will be going back to public transport. I know there's a temporary period while people will either feel unhappy to do that, or while it might even be to some degree unsafe to do that. The city has always thrived on over 90% of people coming to work by public transport. This has been the case since before the last war. And indeed, in the 1990s, the early 90s, we had come up with plans to reduce through traffic in the city, to get as much extraneous traffic out as possible, because people weren't driving to the city, they were driving through it. Our plan was roundly rejected by the elected members on the advice of their chauffeur-driven constituents, who didn't want anything getting in the way of how they got to work by chauffeur-driven limousine. Now, in the early 90s, we had two rather large bombs, courtesy of the IRA in the City of London. And the chauffeur-driven intelligentsia, or bosses, came to our elected members and said, "Oh, you must do something to protect us. Your planners must think of something." So we paused respectfully for a week, blew the dust off the plan we'd had lying around for over 5 years, and put it to committee. And we were greatly congratulated for the speed with which we'd prepared this wonderful plan, this ring of steel to protect the city and its workers. Well, we got what we wanted in the end. We got a reduction in through traffic, only 8 points of entry and exit from the city. Now, the city's been drawing up more recently proposals to pedestrianise parts of the city, either in whole or in part. And that was getting a bit of flack. But of course, now with the need for a temporary introduction of extra cycleways and reducing the carriageways and more space for pedestrians to safely distance themselves from each other, those plans are actually coming into play. Now, I hope they become permanent. If we can stop excess vehicle movements within the city, that would be a good thing. But of course, remember, it's not the authorities that cause the traffic, it's people. You know, if you insist on having your Amazon package delivered to your office, then there will be a plethora of white vans in the city, which shouldn't really be here. And if you insist on using Uber or some of the other startup cargo operations that pass for transport in London these days, then the streets are going to be full of vehicles that don't really need to be there. My mantra is, if you can walk, walk. If you can't, catch a bus, because always planners should be on buses, because that's the only way you can spy on people without them realizing. If I'm not walking and looking around me, then I'm on the top deck of the bus spying on what you're all up to.
Fascinating stuff, Peter. Strangely, buses are the only thing in London I don't really do, but I do walk a lot, and I couldn't agree more on you know the quality of the environment. One thing I've noticed since cars have really left so much of the city is how much more pleasant it is. The explosion of cycling is quite extraordinary. My only gripe is, and if there's anyone from the City of London Police who might see this, enforcing the law so that cyclists stop at red traffic lights is something I'm very keen on. But I'll get off my own hobby horse for a second.
No, Richard, don't do that. I'll add to that, because I was shouting at a couple of cyclists yesterday who were cycling on the pavements, not just one pavement, but all the pavements, when the roads were completely empty. And they looked at me as if I was mad, as if to say, why shouldn't we? Yes, I will agree with you. If cyclists would behave better, I'd be a happier pedestrian.
Well, thank you, Peter. We're at one at that. I'm conscious of time. We've just got one more I'd like to squeeze into the chat, if I may, and that's on development. I can see the cranes behind you. Now, although construction is restarting, development has obviously slowed and in some cases stopped completely in London. Looking ahead, which of the developments, or is there a specific one that you're most excited by?
I've always tried not to have individual favourite buildings or developments. When I was a city planner and I was asked that question, I always used to say the next one, because what's important about the city is the fact that it should continue to change. People would say to me sometimes, won't it be wonderful when it's finished? And I'd say, no, it'll be dreadful because it'll be dead. We want cities that change and adapt to changing circumstances, even when the circumstances are as dramatic as the ones that we've seen recently. So no, I don't have favourites. I still enjoy walking around the city and indeed other parts of London. I see things I don't like, some of which I was responsible for. I see things which I do like, some of which I wasn't responsible for. And I think to myself, well, we stand a pretty good chance for the future because we've had 2,000 years of practice.
Well, that is a long time, as you say, Peter, 2,000 years. And sadly, we are out of time, but that is a good moment to stop. As always, Peter, it's a huge pleasure to talk to you. I'm very grateful to you for spending a bit of time with me and the BCO for this interview. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. And until next time, from Peter and from me, thank you very much and goodbye.